And then finally, we have the idea that these ultimate units of actuality, whether they're quantum collapses or atoms or energetic fields or whatever they are, that they are intrinsically dead, that there's no life in them, that they just are. Just think about that for a minute, right? Matter is supposed to just be exactly what it is, with exactly the form that it has, forever, or from the moment it was created by God, as Newton would say. It just endures through time without any relationship to process. And it doesn't have any value for itself. It's just dead matter. So we're taught all these odd ideas. Brian Swimme calls this a necromorphic vision of reality. Right? That it's just a dead reality out there. Now, in terms of that kind of thinking, we can't make sense out of our everyday experience. We can't make sense out of our emotional lives. We can't make sense out of the fact that we think. We can't make sense of our consciousness, let alone we can't make sense of reincarnation, parapsychology, and life after death. So in order to go forward, we're going to have to leave that behind. We're going to have to leave behind the ideas that we have been taught for our whole lives about what it is that's real out there. We're going to have to reconceptualize reality. Now, that sounds really like big, right? It's like, why would anybody want to undertake reconceptualizing reality? Why would we have to do that just to explain these few phenomena? You know, can't we somehow locate consciousness in the microtubules of the brain and sort of keep everything in the physicalist explanation? And the answer is we can't. It's simply not possible. Right? There is no way to accommodate the phenomena in which we are interested within the framework of a reductionistic scientism. It cannot be done. And our whole thinking about reality in our civilization at this time has become deeply confused. Right? We need to create a new civilization. We're involved in this great work of creating a new civilization because our current one is not working very well. We're in the middle of some kind of immense transformation of the human species. And we are not going to be able to move forward based on the conception of reality which has dominated the last 300 or 400 years. That whole metaphysical vision has run into just too many problems. We need to start fresh if we're going to make any progress. So what I want to do for the next 4 lectures and the rest of this lecture is to describe a new way of visioning reality, a new description of our experience, which leads to a new kind of ontology, a new kind of epistemology, a new understanding of this universe that we're in. We need a new one. Okay. So in order to begin this process, where do we start the process of defining reality? It's a very interesting question. Where do we start? And I want to start, it's kind of arbitrary, right? But I want to start this whole process by starting out making a distinction between the abstract and the concrete. This may seem like a funny place to start, but I want to suggest to you that the distinction between the abstract and the concrete is the distinction that is at the root of all philosophy and all science. Right? So Alfred North Whitehead said, well, somewhere he said, all of Western philosophy can be viewed as a series of footnotes to Plato. Why did he say that? It's a very good question. But one of the reasons he said that is because Socrates and Plato, between them, were the first people in our tradition to really clearly articulate the distinction between the abstract and the concrete, between idea and reality. They were the first ones to pull out into the focus of attention ideas per se. And I think that if we're going to understand reality in a new way, we could do worse than going back to this distinction. This is a really good place to start. So to make this clearer, let's start with an examination of the field of experience. So, our experience is the only thing that we have to work with. We really don't have anything else. To say that our science or our philosophy is empirical is to say that they are grounded in experience. So it's legitimate for us to start with experience. But the work of philosophy always begins with a description of experience. We could be fancy and call it a phenomenology, but we can just say it's a description of experience. All philosophical work, all metaphysical work, all fundamental philosophical work begins by describing experience. And the concepts that we employ to describe our experience are already the fundamental concepts that will shape our philosophical reasoning. And so I'm inviting you to examine your experience. And I'm inviting you to notice that we can divide experience into two very different types of reality, two very different types of entity. One type is events. So this cup in this moment is an event. It's a happening. It's something that is actual. It's part of the world. And we know from our intellectual reasoning that this cup is always changing. Right? At one point it wasn't here, at another point it'll be gone. And at every point in between, subtle changes are going on. Not only is it gradually decomposing as the molecules that don't feel like being a cup anymore fly off in some other way, right? But even if the molecules stay relatively constant, the event which makes up this cup is an expression of the whole universe. Right? The whole 14.5 billion year evolution of the universe is contained in this cup. And this cup is responsive even to the movements of the distant galaxies. It is never, ever the same. Right? It is an event in each moment. And the event, which is this cup at this moment, and the event, which is this cup at this moment, are not the same. Events are never repeated. They're absolutely unique. Right? And so, in terms of events, not only are we constantly changing, but everything in the universe around us is in a constant process of change. Now, if everything was just change, it'd be nothing but a meaningless kaleidoscope. Right? Something is still the same. Since I began speaking about it, the cup is still the same cup. What is it that's the same? If the cup event is different at every moment, what is still the same here? And the answer is that it's the form. The form of the cup hasn't changed, even though there's another cup event characterized or being characterized by that form at every moment. The form and the event, the idea and the event, the object and the event. Right? The cup object is the form that is held by a sequence of events. Right? Now, this is not a distinction we usually make, right? But this distinction opens up philosophy in a brand new way. Not a brand new way, in the way it was first opened up, right? It's a distinction that we have lost and we need to return to. The object is the form, is the idea. The event are the happenings that are characterized by the object. Events are in time. They're in time, they're in space, and they're completely unique. They only happen once. But objects happen again and again, right? This cup object, this particular cup object happens again and again and again and again as we watch, even though the events keep changing. Objects, ideas, or forms are not in time in the same way that events are. And they're not in space in the same way that events are. Right? So each one of you at this moment is seeing a particular shade of bluish green. It may be different for each of you, but you're all seeing that particular color that you're seeing. And at this moment, there might be something else in the field of your experience that has that same color. And also, you might have seen that same color 30 years ago, and you might see it again tomorrow. Right? And every time you see it, it's the same color. Right? It doesn't change in time. And it can have more than one location in space at a time, whereas events are just where they are and just when they are and are never repeated. Can you feel that distinction? Right? It's not easy for us. We don't think about it very much. But to actually begin to differentiate in our experience events from objects, events from ideas, events from forms, brings about a kind of change in the way we see reality. And it turns out that on that basis, many things become comprehensible that are not comprehensible in terms of the modern idea of reality out there, somehow beyond our experience, and already being formed. We can now start to form a description of reality in terms of events and objects, events and ideas, which, as you'll see, makes a lot of sense and opens up the possibility of these parapsychological phenomena and of life after death, as well as explaining science to itself. You see, as you're all probably aware, modern science is a discipline in search of its own justification. It doesn't know why it works. The philosophy of science, as that's been practiced for the last 20 or 30 years, has been a complete failure and has ended up in absolute skepticism. Because given the premises, the modern premises on which the philosophy of science starts, given the idea of some sort of complete ontological separation between experience and thought on one hand and reality on the other, there's no way to make sense of science. But if we start with events and objects, we can make sense of science in an empirical way. Whitehead showed that we can start with our own experience and abstract from our experience the data of science if we do it in terms of events and objects. So this allows us to form a philosophy of science, even though we're not going to do that this weekend. Now, I want to point out that ideas or forms, Whitehead calls them eternal objects, that these entities always are possibilities. An idea, a thought, or a form is a characteristic that events might have. Redness is an idea, but it's a characteristic that certain events have. Roundness is an idea. It's a characteristic that events have. Consciousness is an idea. It's a characteristic that events have. Right? And so ideas are possibilities. Right? They're specific potentials for the determination of fact. Right? If I look at Stuart's shirt and I see it's blue, the idea blue has characterized the events making up Stuart's shirt. And if I then think I'll make a painting like Stuart's shirt, right, then the blueness is characterizing a future possibility instead of a past fact. Right? So I'm suggesting that the distinction between the concrete and the abstract can be mapped on to the distinction between the possible and the actual.